see. Wait, I'm going to click the button, go live. This might do it.
Okay.
That big red button. All right, Dave,
I think we got it.
If I hang up on you abruptly, figured it out.
All right.
I think we got it.
Oh, yep.
I believe in you. All right, peace.
Yeah, wait, I'm going to click the button, go live.
I see it now.
Okay, now I'm hearing myself echoing. And so I think we're good to go.
Make sure you mute that, though, ASAP.
Some.
Okay.
All right, I think we're here.
Yeah, go ahead, Brett.
All right, well, hello, everybody. Thank you so much, for joining us live and being patient. We're millennials and Adnan is, Gen X, but we're acting like boomers today with these tech issues. I think we figured it out, though, and we're ready to go. So welcome, everybody. And again, thank you so much, whether you're a Guerrilla History fan, Red Menace, Rev Left fan, or a fan of all three. So happy to have you here. And this is the first time in Rev Left history we've had all four of us together, same place at the same time. And on top of that, we get to engage directly with you, our wonderful supporters and listeners. So this is going to be about 90 to 120 minutes. We're going to aim for probably a hard deadline at about 2 hours here. But we're going to get in as many questions from the chat as we can, as well as questions that I collected earlier from Patreon, so we can kind of resort to those at various times. But yeah, let's just go ahead around the horn. Everybody introduce yourself for the listeners, although you're probably already known. And Henry, maybe we can start with you. How are you doing? What's up? And who are you, for those that don't know?
Well, it's early. It's 5 o'clock in the morning, my time, but I'm doing well overall. I'm Henry. I'm one of the hosts of Guerrilla History. I hear one of the people typing very loudly, so.
Sorry, that was me.
Okay, that's okay, Allison. In any case, I'm Henry. I'm one of the hosts of Guerrilla History alongside Adnan and Brett. As I always tell our guests, but I know that listeners won't ever hear this, pretty much the only interesting things about me are that I host the show and I currently live in Russia. So that's about it about me. I'll turn it over to Allison next. Why not?
Awesome. Yeah, so my name is Allison. I am one of the co-hosts of Red Menace with Brett, where we tend to pick a text, dive into some review of it, kind of get into what's going on there. We also sometimes cover current events. If you know who we all are, then you certainly know the show. I'm based in Los Angeles, and I've been, doing this podcast thing for a little bit. I have had the opportunity to podcast before with Henry and with Brett, but never with Adnan before. So it's great to have everyone together and kind of, have all of the Rev Left family here. Adnan, I'll go ahead and hand it to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Adnan Hussein. People know me from Guerrilla History, and I'm based in Canada, but am an American and visiting in the Bay Area right now, so I'm not in my normal environs. But I'm really excited by this opportunity to chat, all four of us, and also to engage with listeners with your questions and thoughts and get a good discussion going on about 2022 and also what's ahead. So this is very exciting.
Yeah, and I think we're spanning multiple time zones here, from California to Omaha, Canada, Russia. We got everything going on. It's very early for Henry, late for me, but we're making the best of it, and we're just all happy to be here. I just want to say, just kind of as a way to open up this conversation, I'm incredibly humbled and honored to be able to work with all of you. I really, truly think that all three of you are objectively smarter than me, and so it's always an honor to be with you, to learn from you, to speak with you. And both Red Menace and Guerrilla History have been huge in my life and have been instrumental even in my own continued political development. So thank you all so much for doing this today and just for all the stuff we do together. It really means a lot, and I consider each of you genuine friends of mine. So.
Well, I'd also like to echo that myself, Brett. I wouldn't say that I'm any smarter than you. I work really hard. I never sleep, but I'm also very pleased to have the opportunity to work with you and Adnan, and have had the opportunity to chat with Allison before. But Brett,
I definitely would say that this is definitely one of the most since being involved with guerrilla history and having a chance to engage and interact, and I was a occasional listener of Rev Left Radio beforehand, but it's such a valuable resource, and I know so many people find great inspiration, knowledge in it and Red Menace. And I have myself listened to so many of the Red Menace deep dives and learned so much from them. So I think it's really great to bring us together. I've been hoping that we could call this a revolutionary guerrilla menace as a live stream name for us. And maybe we'll do it every once in a while and menace the world with more thoughts about revolution and guerrilla history and theoretical approaches. And I'm looking forward to the questions as well. We've got so many great questions, tough questions. I don't know how we're going to answer them, but.
And just a reminder for Allison, just a reminder for listeners that we will be taking questions. So if you have anything that you want us to address, you can drop that into the live chat on YouTube. Anyway, Allison, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to just echo those sentiments. I think one thing that I love about this group of people in particular is I feel like we all have so many different perspectives at coming at things. On Red Menace, I really appreciate Brett and I have like very similar views on things, but somehow within those views often come at things from very different angles, which can be really cool. So having some more people here is good. And I always feel like I'm good at like the philosophy stuff, but not necessarily historical perspectives or economic perspectives. So having, the three of you here who can all contribute, the side of things that you have better understandings on, I think will be really awesome for getting into these questions.
Yeah, totally.
All right, well, let's do just that. Questions. And need to pull questions. One that was asked in the chat before we went live from Carson. Carson asks, and this is a good starting question, what in your opinion was the greatest victory for the left globally in 2022 and why? And maybe I'll go ahead and just start off with I think probably an obvious answer. And, it is kind of hard to remember 2022, it bleeds into 2021 and 2020, so I think all of these are more or less going to fit into that time frame. But a win for the left, even with all of its, other variables to consider, I think, is Lula beating Bolsonaro in Brazil. I think the implications for the Amazon are huge. I know that Lula has tacked to the center just to build a coalition capable of beating Bolsonaro. But, with the rise of Bolsonaro and during the Trump years and with, Modi and now Netanyahu back in power, there has been a protracted period of time where reaction seems to be on the march. And to see any one of those, the links in that reaction chain break is a good thing. And specifically with the consequences for the Amazon and climate destabilization and, Bolsonaro's sort of nihilistic reactionary approach of just slash and burn it all for profit. It's a positive thing, at least, to see Lula get in there. And I think I just saw on Twitter before I jumped on that there was even a possible assassination attempt on Lula or a bombing or something. I didn't get the full story because I just peeped it right before I jumped on. But that just shows that, even after a loss, reaction doesn't go away. It gets more violent, gets more desperate. We've seen that in the U.S. We're going to continue to see that, I think. But certainly Lula taking the mantle away from Bolsonaro can be seen broadly as a victory for the left or for the climate or for humanity, however you want to phrase it.
Anybody I can go ahead.
Go next?
Yeah, I can go ahead and take one as well. So, in the context of the US, which I think has global implications, what stands out to me is an incredible amount of union organizing that's happened over the last year. That's happened really interestingly across different sectors. We've seen it in education with the UC system strike, which obviously has had some complicated aspects. We've seen it with the rail strike, also with Starbucks workers, and also further unionization efforts at Amazon. And I think this kind of like cross-industry unionization represents something really big and really important that is happening in terms of the left being able to start to focus on labor and start to focus on actually organizing the working class in the site of labor itself. So that stands out to me. And obviously, I think within the imperial core, when we see this kind of organizing happening, that has the ability to potentially undermine some of the structures of capitalism here, which has global ramifications that need to be considered. I think we have to be honest about the limits of unionism, but the development of these very broad waves of unionization to me seems globally important for the left.
Yeah, I'll go quickly. I don't have anything like groundbreaking to say here. What I would say is that I'm very hesitant in terms of saying whether we have wins or losses because it is an ongoing struggle. Even when we think that we have completed something, it is still an ongoing struggle. Ask any Cuban about the revolution in '59. Of course, it looks like it's a successful revolution. Batista is gone. They have a new government in charge, and that government has withstood the last 63 years. But if you ask any Cuban, they will tell you that it's a very much an ongoing revolution. So I'm always hesitant in terms of chalking things up as wins and losses. I try to look at trends rather than discrete events. But I would say, and this goes back towards what Brett was saying, Latin America was definitely a good trend in the last year, outside of maybe Peru, but Peru is a little bit of an exceptional case here. Castillo, he turned his back on his party. It seemed like he didn't know what way was up at times. And of course, we have seen this, despite his flaws, what can only really be described as a coup in recent weeks. But other than that, much of Latin America was very positive for the left this year. Everything from Colombia to Chile to some extent, although I'm not as big on Boric as many people are. The withstanding of continuous attempts on the Cuban Revolution. Cuba is still up and running, despite everybody might forget, but at the beginning of the year, there was more pushes to try to overthrow the government of Cuba. Which also, was happening last year. We talk about this basically every year. Look, this year there was more attempts to, subvert the government of Cuba. It happened again. But overall, I think that Latin America is a bright spot. It's far from the only bright spot, but I think that having this kind of regional block of countries that is trending in the right direction. Again, not saying that we've really won anything. But trending in the right direction all roughly at the same time does allow for more interlinkages between these countries, both one-on-one in terms of bilateral relations between the countries, but also in terms of, and I know that Adnan might pick up this point, redistributing global power in different ways. So looking at how some of the decisions have been going in the last year in terms of UN votes, in terms of statements on various events that have happened in the past year, which I'm sure will come up at some point, we can see that at this point, much of Latin America is in a block with one another, kind of a liberal left bloc, which, while far from being perfect, having these countries somewhat united in this stance does create more power and give them more weight when they are making their decisions collectively on a global stage. Otherwise, if you just, fractionalize Latin America into these discrete units that each have their own brain with no coordination happening between them, it's very easy to ignore any of them in particular. So I would say that Latin America right now was trending in the right direction, with Peru being a bit of an exception.
Adnan? And one quick comment before I hand it over to Adnan is just on that Cuba attempted coup thing. It's really a textbook lesson, and this is really stark for me because we understand historically how these things have happened in the past. We oh yeah, this is how the U.S. operates. They get people on the ground. They try to set up organizations there that will be activated when needed. But it was really telling in that Cuba coup or that attempted coup where all the media and the political class were right on it. Like they knew it was coming. Right when it occurred, they all came together to get it out as much as they could. It was trending on Twitter. Every politician had to make a statement about it. All the media was covering it. And you could tell that coordination was not a mistake. And you can tell that by many reasons. One of the variables is that it doesn't, the media does not act like that in many other situations. There has to be a reason for it to all come together and coordinate in such a way. And of course, just ideologically, anti-Cuban, anti-Castro, anti-socialist ideology is permanent or permeates the society. So those things are going to happen. But it just seemed all too well coordinated. And it was a really interesting thing to learn from, to see exactly how this plays out in real time.
Right.
But Adnan, go ahead.
Well, just to pick up on some of these themes, I also wouldn't really say that there are a lot of obvious victories for the left. And Henry points out that maybe we shouldn't even think of that because in those terms, because we're in a historical process. But I think it would be nice if there were at least a few clear, victories, or at least things that look like very progressive developments for the left. There aren't that many. I mean, there's some great things that you mentioned, but I think that we are in some kind of a transition. We were chatting a little earlier that it feels like, the era of neoliberalism, whatever period of capitalism we've been experiencing in the mid-late 70s to, these financial collapses in the mid 2000s and in early 2010s, that we're involved in some kind of transition to whatever will come next. And that may not be a victory for the left, but it may be opportunities. It may present opportunities. We are looking at, a possible, undermining of US imperial hegemony, the unipolar moment. So from geopolitical perspectives, there may be openings and opportunities in the global South. My sense is that the US attempts to establish a strict regime of its so-called rules-based order are being challenged by the Friends of the UN Charter, for example. There's been so much overreach in attempting to isolate and marginalize and sanction, and we've had a great series on sanctions as war. In different countries and societies, that in some ways there is a natural cohesion and potential of cooperation to develop a different system, that might unbalance or the dollar as the global currency, and there may be other sorts of things that take place in military terms, in military alliances, as well as these economic ones and the infrastructure of how the global economy has been organized. So that's something, to look out for 2023. We've been noticing it happening over the last couple of years. And it feels like there is some transition, and there are possibilities of a new non-aligned kind of movement. And we've seen that with many countries resisting US pressure. Why did Biden have to have 49 African countries, attend some conference in the US, basically in order to browbeat them and insert the US into, trade and other military arrangements, because people, other countries have not been so cooperative, and they've wanted to maintain independence, and maybe there's more of a chance and an opportunity to do so. That's no kind of victory, and we don't know, in such a transition whether the outcomes could be more negative. In some ways, of course, we can see the rise of right-wing, ultranationalist, proto-fascist or fascistic movements are also organizing, and they have also had victories. And it's unclear, whether 2022, has provided the kinds of opportunities that might lead to a better future or a much worse outcome. But it is being contested. I think that is something that we can say.
Yeah, absolutely. I saw a question come up that's directed directly towards me, so I'll just answer it really quick. It's kind of fun as well, and then we'll jump back into some other questions. Comrade Stu asks, hello, Brett. On Twitter, people have accused you of being a revisionist and called you the Joe Rogan of the left. How would you respond to those claims? Well, first is Twitter. So right there, I mean, people are going to be saying things on Twitter. There's algorithmically inclined outrage, and people go arena, and people are always going to be shitting other people. I could be seen as circle in certain, and so I'm going to be called names from anarchists who don't like me, from democratic socialists who don't like me, from Maoists who don't like me, and from Leninists who don't like me. And so everybody has their own little preferred term as to what they should call somebody they disagree with on Twitter. But the whole point behind Rev Left and my entire thing is not like I have all the ideas in my head and here is my line and this is exactly what I believe on every single thing. With Rev Left in particular, it was always meant to be a broad conversation that was useful to people on the revolutionary left. So I'll have on people that, Maoists, I have had on many anarchists, I have on Leninists. My opinions come through, but it's not really about what I and me believe. People can disagree with those views. I think they come out probably a little more staunchly in something like Red Menace, where I'm really taking the time to work through text and giving my criticisms and my thoughts. But I've always wanted Rev Left to be a welcoming and open environment. And, I really wanted people from day one to just take what's useful. You're not going to agree with every guest. You're not going to agree with every show. You don't even need to agree with me. Who the fuck am I? But if you can listen to these shows and there's something useful in there, then that's a success for me. And I truly believe that, even when I listen to people I really disagree with, even outside the left, like sometimes conservative intellectuals, liberal intellectuals, I could disagree with 98% of what they say, but, they might have given me some food for thought or challenged a view I have or offered some information that I can then take and implement into my sort of circle of concern and my approaches to things. So I don't really get too caught up on what people are calling me on Twitter. In fact, I don't spend very much time on Twitter at all. I just try to keep my head down, do what I think is right, and hopefully provide something useful to people. And if you don't like it, you don't have to like it. There's a million other shows out there, a million other things you could be doing. And as for the Joe Rogan of the left thing, I just think that might come from the fact that I just do have a broad audience of people that comes in, and I'm not temperamentally inclined to, bash everybody that disagrees with me or corner somebody on an issue where I really disagree. I kind of let people talk. And if that gets me called the Joe Rogan of the left, I mean, whatever. But, Twitter is what Twitter is, and I don't let it really get to me too much. So let's go ahead, because that was just all about me.
Let me hop in for one quick second, Brett, just to add a little bit more to what you were saying. People need to understand first and foremost that each of these shows is for the purpose of education. They're not to drive people towards an ideological end. That's what, or in-person organizing and political parties are for, party formation, getting together with a cadre. Like, this is what you do in your own community. You sharpen your own ideological lens in person with comrades. These shows are specifically for the intention of education. Now, that's not to say that we're just doing education for education's sake. We are educating for the purpose of implementing what we've learned in the real world. Now, it's important that we understand that we don't have to agree with everything that everybody says in order to take important things from them. One of the things that we were criticized for on Guerrilla History this year was talking with Noam Chomsky, of all people. We brought on Noam Chomsky onto the show to talk about American empire. Now, Noam Chomsky offers to come on the show. You generally say yes. None of us are ideologically aligned, particularly, directly in line with Noam Chomsky. But to say that Noam Chomsky has nothing of use to offer in the course of a 2-hour conversation, you're not going to learn anything from Noam Chomsky. That's just saying that, it's being, I don't know, it's early. I can't think of the word that I'm looking for, but like, you're being very full of yourself to think that you have nothing to learn in a 1-hour conversation with Chomsky and then 1 hour with Vijay Prashad, which is how that episode ended up working out. It was an hour with each of them. So to think that you're smarter and you have all of the right answers already before you listen to the viewpoints of other people, that's kind of dangerous in itself. But also, it's important to consider that our favorite revolutionaries and our favorite theorists, they were not relying on the works of people that agreed with them on everything themselves. They had to take in information from where it was available. They had to synthesize new information from that existing information and then put it out there. Let's look at Marx. How many communist thinkers were Marx working off of? Not very many. He was working off of all bourgeois scholars, right? Lenin. What's Lenin's, one of his most famous works? Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. This is rooted in J.A. Hobson's imperialism. J.A. Hobson was also a bourgeois scholar. He was not a revolutionary communist that he was basing his ideas off of, but this is the basis for Lenin, one of Lenin's, key works. If we did not have Hobson's imperialism, we may not have Lenin's imperialism. And I think that many of the people who are watching now or listening to the podcast recordings that we're going to be releasing on our respective streams afterwards, these people would all say, well, mostly would say, Lenin's imperialism is a critical work even if, not everything that's in it is applicable to the way that the world is oriented today, we still absolutely need to go through that work. We need to understand that work, and we need to use that work as a basis for analyzing today's situation. That would not have been possible without the bourgeois scholar Hobson, who in many ways was very, very racist. We have to be able to take information from sources that we don't necessarily agree with on everything. We're not looking to these people that we're bringing onto the show as political leaders. We're not voting for Noam Chomsky to be the head of our Communist Party. We're not, bringing on just any person that has something to teach us and putting them in a position of leadership. That's something that everybody has to understand. And I know that the vast majority of the listeners of all of the shows do understand that, they brought on an anarchist, or they brought on a Maoist or a Trotskyist or whatever. If you can't learn anything in 2 hours, either you're way smarter than I am, or you're delusional in terms of you think that you have all of the right answers simply because of your ideology and not because of actual devoted study to the existing material. Adnan?
I would agree with the point that it's really important to be humble. In this work, there's a lot of attraction to being right. I think for leftists, especially if you get involved in theory and thinking through, and that's why I think history is very valuable and sobering, is because it's very difficult to pin down an answer in history. You have to take into account the various forces. It's such a complex, to understand motivation and causality in history is a really difficult thing to do. And we try and think about on Guerrilla History, the lessons that we might learn from things, but you can't be completely definitive about what worked, what didn't work. It's a process, and we have to be humble. We're going to make mistakes. We're not going to be right all the time. Frankly, being right has not really helped, achieve liberation. Obviously, I don't mean that we should go down paths that are, conceptually jejune, make no sense, or are based in false premises. We have to do our best. But sometimes I feel like on the left, we're more concerned with that egoistic position of being right and arguing with others in order to assert that we are in the correct position, where abstractly, Marx never believed in just abstract kinds of ideas. He believed, ideas came from active experience, and what you lose in comradeship and connection by insisting sometimes on being right rather than bringing people in by being humble, by being engaged. We turn people into allies, and we both grow from that. So I think it's important to have a balanced perspective. I might be a little naive, when platforming people whose ideas maybe are going to mislead people, and maybe it's not the right, approach politically or theoretically. I'm not sure. But I do know that more damage can be done by insisting in the sectarian way in anathematizing one another rather than building bonds of affiliation upon which we can cooperate on the things that really matter to us, which is, for Western Marxism. I read a really great critique in the Black Agenda report. I'm forgetting the name of the author. It was a Brazilian Marxist who called out the Western left because he said it's much more concerned with struggling, suffering, having martyrs, and being correct. And it's not enough about actual transformation, building political movements to be effective, and being dissatisfied with being correct but losing. You have to have movements that are organized around trying to win, because that's the change that we need. We may be, it's really a pessimism to focus only on being, correct and being pure. That's actually a form of revolutionary pessimism, because we're putting ahead of actual, meaningful material change, our own sense of being correct, and fetishizing, abstract conceptual or theoretical purity. over the real work, that's necessary. And sometimes it happens because we don't think, and it's indeed easy to fall into this because the forces we're fighting. I just was a little pessimistic. I was saying, I'm not sure there have been that many victories and we need more. And we can fall into the position of thinking that at least being theoretically rigorous and conceptually pure is a substitute for actually engaged action. That is a sign of the weakness of the left, when we fall into that, I think.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that a little bit real quick too, to hopefully finish off the conversation on this. The other thing is I just would like people to take the three shows as kind of, complementary to each other and doing different things, right? Rev Left, I think really what makes it great is that it has a lot of different people on it. I'm here right now because someone tweeted at Brett asking him to have me on Rev Left one time, and I went on, and then eventually we ended up here. And I think Brett's openness to having people who may not have a big platform contact him and want to get a chance to talk is one of the really great things about Rev Left. And in the context of Red Menace, I think one of the things I appreciate over the last year that we've done is I think we have turned in a critical direction in a lot of ways. In the chat, El, I saw you mention that Marx and Lenin, they did draw on bourgeois theorists, but they were also criticizing them. And I really feel like on Red Menace over really the last year, that's what we've started to do, is take works that are outside of what we agree with, figure out what's useful in them, but also take the time to try to criticize them and do comparative and contrasting work to Marxism with them. So each of the shows, in my mind at least, kind of plays a different function for what it is offering in terms of educational material. And my hope at least is that Red Menace, has pivoted, I think, in a lot of ways to being a chance for me and Brett to get out some of our critical thoughts along with kind of constructive summary and comparison. So just kind of throwing that out there.
Yeah, absolutely. All well said. Let's go ahead and move on to a new question. There's so many here. I guess we can kind of try to be quicker with our answers, but it's difficult because these questions are really good and complex. I guess I'll take one from Patreon really quick, and then we'll jump back to the chat. Good question from Patreon is, I would be really interested in hearing the Rev Left family's take on nutrition and physical health and the role politics play in this, because I think it's an enormously important factor of being working class. The role industry plays in our country's general dietary guidelines, their hijacking of science by funding misleading studies and using PR to discredit legitimate research, etc. And also access to nutritious food and the way that it is gatekept by the capitalist elite, the managerial class. So this is a really great question. I'll just open it up by saying that, my first thought here is to reclaim some of these things from the right. There's a thing that's developed recently, mostly in liberal circles, where anything with a lot of emphasis on physical fitness, exercise, and even nutritional health is kind of seen as maybe a suspect, if not outright conservative or reactionary. And I think that's really harmful to the left in general to try to embrace that line of argumentation. We should reclaim anything we can for the left. And there's many terrains that we have to combat our political enemies on many different terrains. And I think this is one of them. I think things like honor and discipline and, fitness are not things that should be used to bash other people over the head or compare yourself to others or put other people down, but it should be something that generally we all strive for in our personal lives, and politically, keeping our bodies and our minds healthy is an important thing. And so when we refuse to engage with this stuff, we cede that territory to the reactionary right. We see what happens. And so again, this is not to judge anybody who doesn't do that or can't do that. And of course, there's the whole consideration of who's able-bodied and who's not. But I think in general, for most people in most places at most times, taking nutrition and fitness seriously is really beneficial. And within our collectives, within our organizations, within our cadres, I know me personally, I have experience in this where we really emphasize that. And we, for a long time, we set a weekend day aside where we'd all meet up, all people of diverse backgrounds, of different body types, of different athletic skills, and we'd all work together. We'd go on hikes together, and we'd be only as strong as our least well-off comrade, and we'd slow down to help them, and that builds unity and camaraderie and solidarity as well. And your points about the industry, of course, are incredibly crucial as well. But I'll let somebody else take this next.
Well, I'll hop in. So first of all, I'd like to echo Brett's point that, we should be doing what we can. I know that there's a bit of in some corners, there's a bit of a fetishization of the person who sits back in their apartment, curled up in a blanket, and reads 150 books a year and is able to think through every problem and answer lickety split. But this is all that they do. We do also have to make sure that we're physically doing well to the best of our abilities, and those abilities are going to vary from person to person. That's not to say everybody needs to be lifting weights, or, like, for example, yesterday I was playing football with my work colleagues. That's soccer for you Americans. Like, this is what I can do. This is what I do. But not everybody is going to have the ability to play football/soccer in just after work with work colleagues. But, if you can, you should. And if you can't, find something else that is beneficial to your body. But turning towards the question of the industry and how politics impacts health, this is a very important question, and one that I've had my eye on for a long time. For people who listen to Rev Left and read Menace, but not Guerrilla History, you may not know, my background is in immunobiology. So I come from the hard sciences. And while looking at the epidemiology and the politics regarding personal health is not immunobiology related, it is something that I have been looking at within my field. And it's very important for everybody to understand that the politics is inextricably tied to the health of the society, the health of individuals within this society. We'll take the United States, for example. In the United States, we, of course, have massive inequality. This is the case in most countries, but the United States is one that I'm familiar with, even though I haven't lived there for a few years. We have food deserts that cover the vast majority of the country. Food deserts are places where people cannot easily walk to places where they have fresh fruits and vegetables. Fresh fruits and vegetables are essential for having a healthy and balanced diet. Why are there these areas that don't have fresh fruits and vegetables, which seems like it should be the basis for a healthy diet? Well, one, they're more expensive. I think that most people understand that, buying nothing but fresh fruits and vegetables is a lot cheaper than getting some heavily processed foods. But also, when we look at the demographic breakdown of these food deserts, they're almost entirely minority majority areas. It's very, very rare that you find a majority white area that is a food desert outside of very rural areas. Like where I grew up is a food desert, and it's almost all white, but that's just because I live in the middle of the woods. Like, you can't really walk to any store from there. But this is, something that is tied to it. We have to look at the racial and class dimension side by side when we analyze, where is the food availability. We also have to consider that just the pressures that are put on working people is going to impact their health, both in terms of the toil that they go under at work, but also in terms of their ability to take time and have a nutritious life outside of work. Take, for example, somebody who works a full-time job and one or two part-time jobs. Let's say they're working 70, 80 hours a week, especially if this person has children. Are they going to have the time to go out to the store, pick up your fresh fruits and vegetables, bring them home, cook up a nice meal for themselves, their children, and then also package some away so that they can eat that nutritious food at work the next day because they're working almost every day? Of course not. When they're away from home, their children are going to have to either fend for themselves or rely on, a partner of theirs. The children aren't necessarily going to be able to make a nice pot of borscht like my wife and I can. They're going to have, boxed macaroni and cheese. They're going to have frozen pizza rolls. This is what these people are going to have to rely on, both from a cost perspective and also the fact that the person has gone much of the time working. And when they get back, they are so physically drained that the last thing in the world they want to do is spend 2 hours making something. So it's very important that we consider that not only are the political forces directly influencing the way that food availability is set up on both a class and racial basis in most countries, but also we have to consider that the simple fact that the way that these societies are set up, these capitalist societies are set up to be a toil on the working people, it makes it so that these people are inhibited from having the time and the resources to be able to go out and have these nutritious home-cooked meals with themselves, their families, if they have them. We have to keep that in mind. There's, of course, a lot more that I could say. in terms of health and politics. We talked about emissions. There was a major study that came out 2 or 3 years ago, and I'll try to be brief because I think I've talked about this on Guerrilla History before, but that was looking at where the money, the revenue from production goes and where the environmental degradation and pollution goes. And they find that when we look at where is the money from an enterprise going, it all flows, not all, it mostly flows to majority white areas, more rich and white areas. And where are the pollution from these exact same enterprises going? Almost all of them go to majority minority areas, particularly Black communities within the United States. So in the same factory, the money goes one way, the pollution goes the other. This is a very, very, this isn't incidental is what I'm saying. This is designed, and we have to keep that in mind. Anyway, I think I've gone on a little bit too long anyway.
Yeah, building on that somewhat, I think all of that's really helpful. I want to shout out real quick what Caitlin said in the chat, which is talking about food deserts as food apartheid. And I think that's a really useful framing because it gets at what you're saying, Henry, that when we actually look at this distribution that's occurring here, it maps onto class and racial lines. And I think it's important to call attention to the fact that those are colonial lines as well, right? And access to nutrition and access to food has actually really been an important tool of colonialism globally for subjugating peoples. So it's not surprising when we take that in mind that in the United States, as you point out, it's often Black communities that are deprived access to nutritional food. But thinking more broadly about North America on the whole, we can also think in Canada, where it's often far north Indigenous communities as well, who have a severe lack of access to food, which is produced, within a more industrial context because of distribution networks. And I think it's not just a racial issue, but it's also a question of settler colonialism and internal colonial contradictions that, very similar strategies to what we saw Britain inflict on India or Britain inflict on the Irish are being applied within North America to, what I would argue are internal colonies that exist there. So I want to kind of call attention to that colonial dimension as well and the continuity that it has with colonialism internationally.
Yeah, without a doubt. And of course, here in the U.S., indigenous communities are among the most impoverished as well, and they have the same exact issues. And so the issue of settler colonialism is really paramount here as well. Let's go ahead and move on. This is a quick one for me and Allison. We'll just get it out of the way really quick. Question for Allison and Brett. What is your favorite episode of Red Menace, and would you consider revisiting the topic of that episode? Allison, you can go.
God, that's a tough one. We have had so many fun episodes. I think on the whole, the series on Wretched of the Earth, which wasn't a single episode, but we split that up into several, that has been my absolute favorite that we've done. I thought those were really, really productive discussions. We had some interesting attempts at thinking about what they mean in the context of North America, what that text might mean for us. And I also just think Fanon is like one of the greatest thinkers we've had the opportunity to interact with. So those all stand out to me, and I would absolutely be happy to revisit Fanon at some point. We have so many ideas for where to go with the show, so that is not a promise by any mean, but yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a great one. Definitely high on my list as well. But I would just say this one, State and Revolution, because it was the first time that Allison and I really worked together on a topic. I believe it was originally released on Rev Left. It was the impetus to the creation of Red Menace. And I was really, really happy with how that episode came out. And I really think that it's a very useful complement to the text itself, as I hope all Red Menace episodes are. I found the Carl Schmitt one recently very interesting. Like, there's very little internal motivation or even time for me to read reactionary thinkers from the past, but I found it very helpful and illuminating. And once you start reading figures like Evola and Schmitt, like we have on Red Menace, you can really start seeing strains of reaction and how they manifest in the modern context. And so I find that to be incredibly instructive as well, while at the same time, of course, being repulsed by the politics that underline that stuff. But it was a learning experience for sure. Let's go ahead and do another one. Let's see here. There's so many. I guess we could ask Henry and Adnan, because this is a question separate, and we just kind of did it for Allison and I. But what's your favorite episode or interview that we've done on Guerrilla History? Does anything jump out to either of you?
While Adnan is unmuting himself, I'll just jump in then and say that the one that I always think back to in terms of, wow, this is somebody that we've interviewed before. I always jump back to the Comrade Joma episode. And Comrade Joma just passed away within the last couple of weeks, and I'm currently in the works of setting up a panel discussion with some people that were close to him on a Comrade Joma tribute episode of Guerrilla History. That's something that our friend Emmanuel Ness, who is very close with him, and myself are trying to put together in the near future. But having somebody who was the founding chairman of a major communist party, an existing communist party, a communist party that is still struggling in an anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist fashion, in the way that the Communist Party of the Philippines is, having the opportunity to interview one of these major leaders, these major founders of these revolutionary movements, was really like a life-changing experience. And I know I didn't really talk about it much, but I did keep in contact with Comrade Joma via email after we were done with the episode. And actually, we were thinking about bringing him back on in the near future when the news of him passing hit. We were talking about doing an episode on People's War specifically. So the opportunity to talk to Comrade Joma and the connection that I was able to, and I'm not saying that I was friends with him. I don't want anybody to take it the wrong way that, I'm Comrade Joma's closest comrade. No. He was just a very friendly person that I would email back and forth with periodically. He would send me some statements that they were putting out. I would ask him some questions periodically, but he was an incredibly kind person, an incredibly principled person, a wonderful theorist. I've got several of his books in my apartment here. And a fascinating interview, as somebody who was a political prisoner under a military dictatorship for years and came out just as resolutely anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist as he was before, is truly astounding. And in a similar vein, just as a brief shout out, the Margaret Schiller episode also was similar in terms of somebody who was imprisoned by a capitalist imperialist nation. She, of course, was a member of the Red Army faction. And we had her on Guerrilla History this past year, I think at the beginning of 2022. And she also was imprisoned, solitary confinement, torture at the hands of the West German state, and came out just as resolutely anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist as she was before. This is really, really not only encouraging, but just eye-opening that there are people that are able to go through those ordeals and stay just as principled as they were before. It's really inspiring from my perspective. Oh, and one last one. Salvatore Engel de Mauro, the Socialist States and the Environment. Fantastic book, fantastic interview. And Salvatore has ended up being one of my closest friends since we did that episode. It turned out he was a Guerrilla History listener before we asked him to come on the show. He came on the show. We had a great time. And he and I have been very close friends ever since. And we're even co-editing a new translation of Lacerdo's Stalin book that'll be out within the next month or two, I would hope. We're just in the final editing phase before it goes to print with Peaceland Bread. So that was a really enriching experience for me, just in terms of making that connection with somebody who has ended up being a really, really close comrade of mine. Adnan?
Well, I've just enjoyed pretty much every episode. I've gotten something important out of it, so it's very hard to pick. And I do think that the interviews with activists, people who led communist movements or suffered and were imprisoned as in the course of struggle, those are really special episodes. I mean, I would like to look forward to, hopefully someday perhaps we might be able to interview Leila Khaled, for example. I saw a really great interview with her on Rania Khalek's show Dispatches, and I've met her briefly in the past, and I have some context. I think that would be also another one of these wonderful opportunities to talk with someone who has engaged in struggle and sacrifice. So that's not an episode in the past, but I would say looking forward, I think that would be in the vein of those great episodes that you mentioned, Henry. But I guess maybe my current favorite episode has yet to come out, is a discussion with Jason Moore. I think his work is absolutely fascinating and really important, and it's helping me think through issues in medieval history, integrating ecological and environmental factors, into analysis of capitalism and imperialism. So I say look forward to that one, because I think it's going to be one of the great episodes of Guerrilla History.
And Adnan is not just saying that because we also know that Jason Moore listens to the show. So he will hear this, but that's not why we're saying that we enjoyed the episode, Jason. We're not trying to butter you up. You've already been on, and we have plans to bring you on again. It was really a great conversation. I hope everybody looks forward to that. Brett, you're also part of Guerrilla History. Why don't you briefly tell us about what one that stuck out in your mind is?
Sure. Well, really quickly, somebody in the chat here says, are you ever planning on covering the Ethiopian People's War? And there's that book, like Ho Chi Minh, like Che Guevara, that we've talked about, we've batted around, and I would love to do that this year for Guerrilla History. There's so many. When you guys were talking about Guerrilla History, I was kind of thinking about Rev Left, because we answered Red Menace, we answered Guerrilla History. So let me just go ahead and answer Rev Left. It's so hard because, one, there's a memory issue, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of conversations, and I get asked this question and I answer it, and then driving home later, I'm like, damn, I should have mentioned that or something else. So I'm not going to say this is my favorite one, but one that I found very moving and very informative was on Rev Left, our interview with Kevin Rashid Johnson, who, is a Maoist political prisoner, an artist as well. And the first person, and we literally did the interview with him in prison. So every 15 minutes or so, the call would end. We'd have to call back, reestablish the connection. And he talked about the torture, just being cornered in his jail cell, having dogs stuck on him, and then a bunch of guards run in and beat him brutally. The racial politics in certain prisons versus other prisons, how some prisons really are completely self-segregated by race, and you have to pick a side. And Kevin would talk about how he would defy that. And the consequences that would come from trying to defy that. And in other prisons, that just simply doesn't exist. So I found it a crucial episode with regards to the insight into how the carceral system actually works. And more on top of that is a political prisoner, and it is sort of oppressed within that context further for his political aspects and organization and struggle, etc. And then trying to engage politically in the context of prison. He talks about those experiences that he's had, trying to reach out to people and elevate their social and political consciousness, and see what he can do on that front. So I would highly recommend that as well. So many great ones. Of course, I'm going to remember a bunch when I'm driving home. But let's go ahead and move on to this next question here. And maybe Adnan might be able to say something more meaningful than I could on this. But the question is, as someone who grew up in a quasi-fundamentalist evangelical background, I've been trying to figure out how and when Christianity reinvented and devoted itself to being a predominantly exclusionary and often nationalist framework, as opposed to a call to show God's love in a universal manner. And this is a really wonderful question. I don't have deep historical knowledge on the evolution of Christianity as a whole, but I do see what Christianity became in the United States, where that sadly is the sort of predominant posture of Christianity writ large in the United States, one of conservatism, if not outright reaction, and I always find it utterly perplexing, using Jesus Christ and his message as the justification for someone's bigotry or insanely reactionary politics, justifying inequality, right? These things are so on their face antithetical to the actual message of Jesus Christ that I'm continuously flabbergasted that people not only call themselves Christians, but make it the main form of their identity and stand pretty much on every single issue against what we could only imagine the position of Jesus Christ would take, one rooted in universal love and unconditional compassion. So that is just like a quick thought off the top of my head. I'm sure it has something to do with settler colonialism and white supremacy and capitalism, because religion can take many, many different forms. Even the same religion takes many, many different forms, depending on the context in which it is established. And of course, the church as an institution of power and influence can very easily and historically has cozied up to other institutions of power that have not been savory, to say the least. So it's an interesting thing, but I do always want to stress that Christianity, like all religions, are still in the process of evolution, and they are a terrain of struggle. So rather than fetishizing atheism or trying to overemphasize that, especially on the left, that might have served a purpose, 100 years ago when the religious context was very different. But today, I think it's an albatross around our neck to try to promote atheism. I think we should find interesting aspects of every religion, see how they dovetail with our goals and our politics, embrace them, learn from them, and vice versa. And so I really want to just always emphasize the continued evolving nature of religions, and that they're an important terrain of struggle for us as communists.
Well, not much to add there, because the last several points that you made are really, I think, the key, that it's a terrain of struggle. And of course, it is also not a simple kind of field of analysis of like Christianity. I mean, it's a global religion, over 2,000 years of history, and it always has in it the possibility of inspiring people to fight for equality and for these human sorts of values, or it can easily be used, especially when connected to an institutional sort of church structure, to conservative conservative forces. And of course, that's the context in which, Marx was writing, is, having to try and disestablish the church. But I guess the short answer for me is that if you want to look to a period, I mean, there are many periods where, say Constantine making it or converting to Christianity, and then the Edict of Milan later in the 4th century, where it becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. And you have this intersection now between a kind of confessional form of religion and empire, to something that I would call a confessional empire that enforces it as dogma, supports an institutional framework of the church, and turns it into a legitimating tool of empire. Obviously, this is a deleterious movement in the history of Christianity. And I think the other big period is the Crusader period, and what transforms in Europe and the Latin Church, the construction of Christendom. And people who are interested in my more deeper analysis on this subject, 2 things. One, I'm doing a class that's still going on. It's called the Crusading Society. It's free, open, online. I do it on Saturdays, 9:30 to 11 Eastern. We're taking a holiday break. We'll be resuming again January 7th. And what we're looking at is essentially the way in which a certain orientation within Latin Christianity in the medieval period establishes a new kind of persecuting society, and war and militarism externally that really are part of the roots of what we might think of as white nationalism or white supremacy, settler colonialism, and Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. These are all interconnected in my view. And so if you're interested in kind of thinking about those issues, join my course. We still have quite a few weeks, and you don't need to have any background. And I am working on a book, or a short book called The Formation of a Crusading Society, that will look carefully at what transforms in the medieval period. I'm not going to say it's the only or definitive transformation of a version of Christianity that has deleterious effects and consequences, but it is a major and very important one in crystallizing some key features and roots of some of the contemporary problems that we're dealing with today. I do this not to demonize Christianity as a religious system, but hopefully that it can be decolonized, that it can be liberated. And, it provides spiritual and, ethical meaning for people, but that needs to be directed towards human liberation and the cause of justice, like we've seen in movements like liberation theology. That could happen again, but right now, of course, we're facing the most right-wing version of it in the United States. So understanding that history might help us think about the ways in which different paths within any of these world or global religions or ideological systems can be geared and oriented towards liberation rather than oppression and exploitation.
Yeah, I think all of that's really fantastic. And, I think it's hard the way the question poses this of like, what is the moment that this happens? Because there are transformations throughout Christianity's history that have to be wrestled with. I should preface that my knowledge of Christianity, having been raised in it, is mostly Western Christianity. So I can't speak extensively to Eastern Christianity, which has a divergent history in many ways once you reach the Great Schism. But nonetheless, I think, there's a couple points that matter. One, obviously, as Adnan said, is the, in making Christianity the religion of the Roman Empire, right? The role Constantine plays there is obviously very, very important. But also for thinking about Christianity as it shapes in the West and in the United States in particular, I think we also have to think about some particularities with Protestantism and the way that Protestantism in the US operates as often like a very conservative reactionary force. The question asker, pointed to how did Christianity get tied to nationalist frameworks as well? And I think, thinking about the Protestant Reformation as well, we can think about the Protestant Reformation as a political and religious rebellion against the authority of Rome to a certain degree, and to the political institution of Catholicism. And it's not surprising that the early Protestant churches aligned themselves with what we wouldn't quite historically identify as nationalist, but perhaps proto-nationalist developments within the European countries where they occurred, like Germany, but also within the Calvinist movements, which had a political bent to them as well. So when we're encountering kind of right-wing Christian nationalism in the US, I do think it's worth considering the way that that is a predominantly Protestant phenomena, and Protestantism and the Reformation had a political dimension, which I think is relevant there as well. So I think that's important to point out. And then the other thing, just to echo what everyone's saying, is like, regardless of how we feel about Christianity, Christianity exists. A huge amount of the masses we hope to organize are Christians, right? And are committed to that. And what's really important, I think, is to be able to converse with Christians and put forth arguments for communism in the terms that they believe in and in the terms that they speak. And there's so much within the Christian tradition that we can point to as well that can be very, very useful. I was raised pretty fundamentalist myself. I still talk to family members who are into that, and would try and push my politics with them. I'm citing the Gospels to them. I'm citing the texts that they hold very important to them to try to augment arguments for why a communist vision is correct. I think, if we look at the mass movements that have occurred globally that have had success, the National Democratic Movement in the Philippines has done a good job of incorporating youth Christian groups in particular, who may not even identify as communists, but are willing to come into coalition with the cause for national democracy and articulate their cause along Christian lines. I see that as a very, very good example of what ought to be done here. So, the history is important, but also in the present, we need to be able to wrestle with Christianity, and we need to be able to talk to working people who are Christians and try to show that the value system they subscribe to can lead towards progressive alliances with communists, if nothing else.
Absolutely. And that's true for Jewish people, for Muslims, for Buddhists, for anybody engaged in any religion. Like, we have to figure out how to talk to people like that. And I think something that hopefully we do on Rev Left, and I think Allison shares this with me, if not everybody here shares this, is that reclaiming of something important in these religious traditions, something beautiful, gorgeous, worth keeping, and not discarding or dismissing. I came out of new atheism as a angsty 20-something, reacting to, some early religious experiences that I had. And I can see the fault lines, the faultiness of that stuff today quite well. And I have a deepening respect for religious traditions in general. And of course, in every single religion, the political spectrum exists, right? There's right wing and left wing and centrist forms of all of these religions. And I think that's interesting as well. But I would recommend, if you haven't already heard, I've had on Adnan to Rev Left twice, once to talk about Sufism and once to do an episode on St. Francis. And I really, really am proud of those episodes and would highly recommend anyone interested in this religious conversation to go check those out. And hopefully in 2023, Adnan can come back on and maybe we can do an intro to Islam or talk about the Crusading Society. We've talked about having an episode on the Islamic mystic Rumi before. So there's lots of more work to be done on those fronts, to be sure. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next question. And MSJG asks, this is really interesting, why have Leninists turned to nationalism and even traditionalism and anarchists to nihilism? Is it just doomerism? So I think this is a very interesting point. I think Allison and I have discussed it a little bit, but before I open up, I'll let maybe Henry, if you have something particular to say on this topic, you can start and we'll get to my thoughts.
Yeah, and I know, okay, microphone's there it is. So I think that what we have to remember is that this is not solely, but primarily an online phenomenon. I think that if we're talking about Leninists and nationalism and anarchists and nihilism, if you talk to Leninists and anarchists in person, you're not going to find very much nationalism, and you might find a little bit of nihilism, but I think that you'll find much less of it in person at actual organizing, at actual activism and, political work than you would online. I think it's very easy for people to play to these sorts of tropes online. I think that they play well to, a not super engaged audience, somebody that is not going deep into the ideological and political theory that they're talking about, somebody that is not involved with actual movements in the real world. It's very easy to put out these very nationalistic, clickbaity things. It's very easy to put out clickbaity, nihilist things. It plays well online. Let's be frank about it. People that use these nationalist and nihilist tropes online, they tend to get quite a bit of traction. It's really hard to get traction as a principled Leninist or a principled anarchist online. The traction that you get is going to be sequestered into, a dark corner of the internet. It's going to be the same people that you would expect to be interested in this. And, their attention is split 100 different ways because there are a fair amount. I know that sometimes it seems like we're all alone. There are a fair amount of principled Leninists. There are a fair amount of principled anarchists, state whatever. I know I'm just bringing up these two because they were what we're asked about in the question, but, pick your ideology. There's going to be many people that are very principally engaged in real world activity that share your ideology, and they're not going to have nationalist tendencies for the most part. They're not going to have nihilistic tendencies for the most part. So I think that this is like the first thing that we have to understand is that the main place that we will see these tendencies of nationalism and nihilism is online because they play very well to people that are not actually engaged in struggle and movement in the real world. Now, I know that we are all engaged in real world activities in our own ways, the four of us. Unfortunately, I can't talk about much of what I do for various reasons off of here, but we all are engaged in real world activity, organizing and struggle. I have not seen very much nationalism. Now, in institutionalized parties, I will say that this is something that's going to be different in my context than in your context. The United States does not have a major socialist or communist party. There are socialist and communist parties, but not a major one. The context of Russia is a little bit different. The Communist Party of the Russian Federation is the second biggest party in the country. It's the largest, quote unquote, opposition party, but it's an institutionalized opposition party. And so what we've been seeing, particularly in the last 2-3 years, and especially within the last year, is that there has been quite a bit more nationalism seeping into the messaging that's coming out from the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. And within the last year, it makes sense given the current situation. And again, I'm limited in terms of what I can say on that. But I think that we need to understand that when we're talking about people that are principally engaged in actual struggle, they're generally not going to be in institutionalized positions, and they're not going to be doing all of their activism online. If you're just tweeting your thoughts out there and that's the only work that you're doing, you are not an activist. If you're just tweeting thoughts out there and seeing how many likes that you can get, you're not organizing. You can't organize. You're not an activist if it's solely online. You have to get out and meet with real people. So I think that this is something that's really important to understand. There's a lot more that I could say, but the other people on this panel are definitely probably more qualified to talk on these issues than I am. Those are just my initial thoughts, is that we have to look beyond online. That is, of course, easiest where that's where you're going to see most of it. And that's where we're going to be exposed to it. And, you turn on Twitter on your phone, that's what you see. So you have the impression that this is like a dominant tendency within this ideological movement. It's not. It's just not. Allison?
Yeah, I'll follow up on that with a couple of things. I mean, one, I do want to kind of emphasize what you said, Henry, which is that this content is easy to produce, right? Kind of the nice thing about nihilism and about kind of like trolley traditionalism is you don't have to take your opponent seriously. You don't have to make real answers to them. You've already kind of thrown that out. And so it's very easy to push it in this kind of low effort way that then gets picked up by algorithms that favor controversy and high levels of engagement, whether negative and positive. And so the very structure of Twitter and these other spaces, I think, is easily manipulated by these kind of things. So that's worth considering. And then the other thing, we talked about this on Red Menace a little bit, is that I do think these attitudes come from a sort of burnout or desire to give up a little bit, which is worth thinking about. If you're an anarchist, right, and you tend to be on the very left side of things, one thing that can happen is that you will see movements continually not living up to that. I think often a thing that anarchists, especially the more organized anarchists I know have struggled with, is seeing movements either move to forms of organization that they don't like after having been more anarchist and that being a defeat, or seeing movements fizzle out. Leninism similarly, right? How many little micro Marxist-Leninist parties have we seen in the US that have fallen apart? There have been so many of them. And in both of these instances, one easy way to kind of deal with the frustration of that is, to try to take a step towards nihilism on the one hand or traditionalism on the other. If you embrace nihilism, then those failures don't matter, right? The catharsis of it, just the lashing out was enough, and that's good enough, and you don't ever have to achieve anything. So it doesn't feel like you're giving up because you're kind of reframing what the goal is, but you are essentially giving up. And in the other direction, with Leninists who have kind of turned towards traditionalism and reactionary nationalism, right? You get to kind of redefine things, say that liberalism is the main enemy, and hey, there's these forces that have all the status quo of capitalist ideology behind them that also, superficially contradict with liberalism. What if I just throw my weight behind them? And again, you don't feel like you've given up because you've reframed things, but you've completely given up the part of the fight that matters, which isn't just the fight against liberalism, but the fight against capitalism and liberalism as an ideology that capitalism can promote in a political form it can take. So I think there is also a frustration, burnout, disappointment aspect that really is a part of it and matters. So I would say that is the other thing too. But again, I think this is mostly online. It also probably is mostly online people who tend to succumb to that kind of cynicism and nihilism in the first place as well, because you're not engaged in struggles where you could actually be finding hope in the first place.
Yeah, just one really quick thing before, I know Adnan and Brett probably also have things to say on this, or perhaps we'll turn to another question. I'm not sure. But one thing that Allison was touching on, and is something that I've said before, is that anti-liberalism is not an ideology. And this is something that many people make the mistake of, is looking at what liberals are saying and then just flipping to the other side of the argument because, we hate liberals. I think that most of the people that are watching this, maybe you don't hate liberals in terms of oh, this person's a liberal, I hate them individually, but we hate that ideological movement. Of course, we're not liberals on this show. The liberal ideology is not an ideology that we ascribe to, but your ideology cannot be anti-liberalism. Your ideology has to be for something, moving towards something. This is also, goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, or at least what I was mentioning at the beginning, that you have to learn things from people that you don't agree with. In the same way, we can't just say, liberalism is not my ideology, let me throw everything that they say out. That's throwing the baby out with the proverbial bathwater. Of course, most of what they say is not going to be conducive to building our political movements. We have to be very clear about that. We can't rely on allying with liberals. Their ideological project is different than ours. We have a different end entirely. But on terms of issue by issue, there are many people that succumb to anti-liberalism as an ideology when they see some person that is a liberal or is representative of liberals, etc. And again, this is primarily an online tendency, and there's some people that I could call out by name that I won't because I'm a nice person and, you know, whatever. But basically what they do, they follow all of these big liberal accounts, you know, MSNBC, the individual MSNBC hosts, the people that write for the New York Times that have, you know, been favorable of Democrats, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what they do, anytime this person puts out a statement, they just take the opposite position, even if it makes other things that they've said in the past in contradiction to their current statements. Because they are making anti-liberalism their guiding principle, their guiding ideology. You cannot have a negation of an ideology as your ideology because it does not have an end in mind. We have a definite end in mind, and that end is a stateless, classless society. We may disagree, and I know that, you know, we're different people. We may not agree on every single point. And you as the listeners, you may be coming from different ideological tendencies. Most of you are going to have that same end in mind. It's the mode of reaching that end that we're going to have differences on. Those are discussions that are worth having because we have a defined ideology with a defined end. Never fall into the trope of being an anti-liberal as your identity, because this is just a negation. It's not actually building anything.
And of course, bouncing off that exact point, fascism is anti-liberal. Being anti-liberal is not enough. And it's not a coincidence that in both the reactionary Leninists and in the anarcho-nihilists, there is a lot of reaction and even pseudo-fascism permeating those movements, because precisely as Henry has said, anti-liberalism in and of itself is insufficient. It doesn't tell you anything about what you believe in. And so that's a part of it. Other part, as people have said here, people online are really more interested in a lot of situations in building an online identity than they are in actually pursuing, learning, and deepening their understanding of politics or of the Marxist tradition or the anarchist tradition, whatever. It's a lot easier to go online, make pithy comments, build a little following, build an online identity than it is to engage in real world politics. And a lot of people, of course, are also interested in brand building and opportunism. Right? When the cultural winds shift a little bit and it seems like the wind is at the back of the right, you see a lot of these people start shifting their rhetoric and their ideas and their values over to the right because that's where the audience is. And so, you know, I really, you know, being online is fine. There's a place for it in everybody's life. But I really think that like limiting your time being online is incredibly crucial, because I think if you spend too much time online, it does something to you. You're not changing the internet's changing you. And so I really see as like another thing I have to moderate in my life. You know, I might spend 15, 20, 30 minutes on social media a day and then call it quits. And I think that is kind of healthy. You can dabble in it, but if you're in it all the time, you're going to be in echo chambers. You're going to be algorithmically pushed to see certain things and not see other things. You're going to start getting a distorted picture of how things actually are in the real world. And that is detrimental to our politics in general, and probably to you as an individual and your mental and emotional health. Adnan, do you have anything to add to this, or would you just want to jump to the next question?
Yeah, we can jump to the next question. I just thought it was a great question because it does get at this problem I think I was alluding to of the pessimism of the position we find ourselves in. It's possible to have all kinds of these deviations and unproductive things coming out of that unfortunate condition. So I would just echo what you've been saying. And God, I hate liberals, but you know, that's not enough. I mean, emotionally, that just the whole temper of liberalism I find just deeply disturbing and annoying. And yet that reaction, that reactive approach, that's being polemical and reactive, that's not going to get us anywhere. It just gets us down these rabbit holes that are unproductive. So I think we can move on to another question.
Absolutely. All right. Well, let's have a fun question really quick, and maybe we can be quick about this one. Judd asks, if you were to flee the imperial core, where would you go and why? Anybody want to start that one off?
Well, that seems like exactly the kind of question you shouldn't answer if you plan on fleeing the imperial core.
Good point.
Yeah, I guess if nobody else is going to go first, I might as well. So as I've mentioned once or twice before, I try not to make too much out of it. I know that it's very, I mean, it's a fact that I live in Russia now, and I could just be online all the time being like, "Hey, I live in Russia." No, this is not what I try to do with it. It's just a fact. I have to acknowledge that. Um, Whether or not Russia is the imperial core, some people would like to argue yes. I think the vast majority of people who are looking at imperialism from the more traditional Leninist sense, or in terms of a dependency theory or world system sense, it's not the imperial core per se. And so, hey, I'm already here. Like, I have already fled, and I'm living here, engaging here. My wife and I are happy here, don't have any plans of leaving. But if I was to go somewhere else, I know she and I have both talked about, Cuba would be a very, very cool place that we would like to also get to spend some time in. And if we did leave, that would be one of the places that we would consider going to, in terms of, having somewhere to engage with in actual struggle that is like I said, it's not complete. It's an ongoing struggle, but it's currently a successful struggle. And so that's something that would be really interesting.
Sure, I'll just jump in and say, it's hard to think of a specific country. Cuba is an obvious one. Venezuela would be interesting. I'm really interested in general in Latin America, and I have a deep life goal of my family on my wife's side is Mexican, and they're actually descendants of Emiliano Zapata. And we have really fascinating conversations with them. And all of us talk about visiting various parts of Latin America. And I have a goal personally to try to learn Spanish. So I think in that general direction is probably where I would head south. But that's for other reasons, family and personal goal stuff, as well as politics.
I would just say, who says the folks in those other places outside the imperial core need us or want us to flee the imperial core, join them when we have work to do here. We're here. We've had a lot of benefits of growing up, being educated, in the imperial core. What are we doing with the resources that are available to us? I think we have a big responsibility. So don't leave the imperial core. Join others in struggle, and let's break it apart. Let's take it down. Let's make a better world. I mean, we can do a lot more good by perhaps stopping the worst excesses of imperialism and corporate capitalism destroying our planet and killing people around the world by fighting here. So let's do it. Let's fight here. And then maybe, if you need a break or a vacation and some comrades, then swim to Cuba, as somebody said in the chat. I myself would go to Turkey just because I, speak the language a bit. I have family and I like the Middle East, and that's no endorsement of the regime there, but I think it's a very interesting place. So that would be fun to get away.
Allison, you want to throw in?
Yeah, sorry. I was trying to get that unmuted. Yeah, I mean, I think, I really agree with Adnan's answer. It's not like a thought I even like to entertain, because it feels like there is a responsibility as someone in North America to consider that, and that the rest of the world, does not need us to go and take that there. I will second real quick, though, Adnan's answer that in terms of not fleeing, but getting somewhere else. Turkey is actually a country I would really like to return to. I had the opportunity previously to spend 2 weeks there, and it was an incredible experience and just absolutely wonderful. And pretty much since then, I've consistently really thought about how much I would love to go back and get a chance to visit again. So that is a place that's high on my list as well. But, fleeing, no, I think that's an abandonment of a responsibility, and a responsibility that's imposed by how much we all have, to a certain degree, benefited from imperialism and from our position within the imperial core.
So me and Henry trying to have a fun, nice answer to the question, and both of you guys have to rain on our parade. I get it. But yeah, let's go ahead and I think Karaoke Computer speaking. I don't really know if that's a name, but kind of with the previous thing we were talking about, they said thoughts on the notable increase in anti-capitalist rhetoric and themes in Western media and how it functions as a release valve for capitalism to absorb its own critique. And I think that is a wonderful follow-up to that. And I think that's part of the ideological adaptation and the resilience of capitalism is its profound ability to reincorporate critique as a commodity that it can then sell back to you. And there is an aspect in which it does act as a release valve. You can go watch Parasite, the movie, right? You can go to a punk show, go to a hardcore hip hop show. I went to a Dead Prez show. It amps you up. On one level, it sort of deepens your radical politics, your revolutionary zeal, and your commitment to the cause. And so I think that can be helpful. It's not all bad. But on the other hand, I think it does largely work as a sort of release valve for those contradictions and that critique, and it kind of preempts anybody else from being able to do that through itself. Now, the people making these media products in particular are not doing this in a conscious way. I'm ideologically trying to preserve capitalism, so let me create a release valve. They actually are really ushering in genuine critiques of it. But capitalism is so able to absorb those critiques and turn them into commodities to sell back to you. It's really one of its genius powers, if you will, its dark powers. But that is something that has always been true for the last, definitely since World War II and the rise of mass media. That has been a skill of capitalism. And I don't really see a way around it, precisely because I think there is some benefit in that. When people watch Parasite, they might be introduced to a critique that they never had, or hear a hip hop or a punk song and be introduced to a sort of militant posture towards the powers that be that can be beneficial. And a lot of people are radicalized through those processes. So I know hip hop for me was absolutely huge in the radicalization of my politics. And so I wouldn't want to ever take that away. But it's certainly something we have to wrestle with. And I don't think anybody has really found a really good answer for how to get around that.
I'll just hop in quickly. First, to mention that Karaoke Computer is, of course, our friend Mikey from Shut Down Red Hill Oahu Water Protectors. We have an episode with Mikey on the effort to shut down Red Hill. And I guess I might as well, this will be the first time that we've publicly announced this, but Guerrilla History is actually going to be launching a spin-off show in the next couple of weeks with people who listen to Guerrilla History may remember that we had a panel discussion about how political education and historical knowledge is crucial for activism and organizing. And we had a great panel. And this panel is going to be like a rotating series of hosts for this other show, which is currently going to be called Guerrilla Radio, which kind of combines Guerrilla History and Revolutionary Left Radio. And Mikey will be one of the co-hosts of that show, that rotating series of hosts, which we're calling the Partisan Brigade, which I think is a pretty cool name myself. But in any case, I do agree with everything that Brett is saying. One thing that we have to always remember is that there is a limit in terms of what is able to proliferate in Western media. So while we may have things like Parasite that have what most people would consider to be pretty explicitly anti-capitalist messaging and critiques of capitalism, at the very least, if not explicitly anti-capitalist, you can't go too far out of bounds with that. You can't show, imagine if we made a movie, and maybe, hey, everybody should donate to the Guerrilla History Patreon. Maybe we'll make a movie about the liquidation of the landlords in China, for example. Like, is that ever going to be something that's going to make it in Western media? Like, are you going to go to the movie theater and watch a movie about the liquidation of the landlords and the redistribution of the land? I don't think so. It'd be great, but I don't think so. Also, we have these other media narratives to obfuscate these points. So just think of when Parasite came out, which admittedly I have not seen. I just don't have time for movies, really. But when Parasite came out, and reading the synopsis and interviews with the director, it became very clear that it was a movie that was a critique of capitalism. But what were the first articles that we saw coming out? No, this is not a critique of capitalism in South Korea. It's a veiled critique of the communism of North Korea. I saw multiple articles coming out from sites like I believe that there was one that came out from the New York Times in terms of their culture section, but also in terms of other, obviously Fox News is saying similar things to this. I had seen multiple interviews, multiple pieces that have come out to obfuscate the point that, hey, this is a critique of capitalism, and say, no, it's a, satirical look at what North Korea is like, even though it's being filmed by a South Korean director saying, this is a look at what South Korean society is like, hyper-capitalist South Korea, which is essentially just a US military base operating on the Korean peninsula. So there is going to be obfuscation, and there is a limit in terms of what you can go and show. There's obviously the limitations in terms of funding. If there's any billionaires that are watching this and are somewhat, appreciative of anti-capitalist messaging, first of all, just what are you doing? But second of all, well, you can utilize these resources to try to get things like that out, very explicitly anti-capitalist. But I just don't see that happening. It is a release valve in the sense that it makes people think that there is that critique out there, and there is that critique out there. Again, we're not criticizing the director of Parasite or things like that. That critique is out there, but there's a limit on it. There is certainly a limit.
Yeah, following up on that a little bit too, I think that there's also an open question in my mind to the extent to which these films are anti-capitalist, right? So I don't want to be a hater here. Parasite's one of my favorite movies of the last few years. I think it's really exceptional. And these films express, I think, a real enmity that a lot of people feel towards the rich and the powerful. But the criticism in them is not quite anti-capitalist, right? In as much as it's not really a critique of the property relations that produce that situation, which would be fucking hard to do in a film, admittedly. But it's not really critique of that. It's a critique of kind of the degeneracy of the rich, the moral weakness of the rich. It's very much a focus on the way that rich people behave in particularly vile ways. Outside of Parasite, the other movie that just came out that I've been seeing a lot of people saying oh, how did this get made in a capitalist society, is Glass Onion, the new Knives Out movie, which is sort of a satire critique on Elon Musk and on rich people generally. And again, the focus is always on kind of the incompetence of the rich, the moral vice of the rich, but never necessarily on how they got there. That movie in particular, I think really the problem with the rich people in it is that they're cheating the system in some way. They haven't fairly gotten themselves there, which still leaves room there for the idea that one could fairly position oneself as the owner of a large company and not cheat on their way to the top. So I do think there is also this slight misdirect where what is called attention to isn't so much the system of capitalism that produces this, but the individual people who act monstrously or incompetently or silly on top in a lot of these films. So it is a release valve, and it also is kind of a redirect and individualization of the problem to a certain degree that I think can take away people's focus on the actual economic realities at play there.
Absolutely. And for what it's worth, when there's a glut or an uptick in the amount of cultural production that fully or not, half-assedly or not, critiques the basic structures of society or inequality or capitalism itself, I think that's signaling something in the general milieu of people's consciousness and minds that is things aren't working, and it's going to come out in different ways. Different artists are going to give it different spins. It's not always going to be as principled or as full of a critique as those of us on the Marxist left would want. But I think there is something being signaled in the cultural, sort of collective consciousness that the way we're doing things is coming up against some grand limit, and so on that sense, I think it's at least interesting to see a rise in that sort of media as weak as it can sometimes be. But yeah, let's go ahead and move on to a next question. This one's really good. It's actually very deep as well. Gary asks, how can we as communists develop a philosophy of law and rights to supplant classical liberalism's grip on defining freedom? What would a Bill of Rights under communism look like? It can't just be a list of individual negative rights like we have now, freedom from government, don't tread on me. If the superstructure of law reinforces the base, then a socialist jurisprudence will be crucial. I'd like to know what you all think about this. So the first thing is I really love your emphasis on negative freedoms versus positive freedoms, because I think that's crucial. And I think that is one of the main differences between liberalism and socialism. So, there is a place, I think, for the constraint of any power structures, and liberalism was concerned, coming out of feudalism as it was, with constraining the power of the authoritative state. So you kind of understand how those things would arise negatively, but then they get taken in all these different directions as time goes on, and different cultures and histories take up these ideas. But I love that emphasis on positive rights. What would a Bill of Rights under communism look like? I don't know for sure, but it would definitely include things like every human being has a right to a house. Every human being has a right to healthcare. Every human being has a right to a clean, safe environment. You could even say, maybe even during a socialist transition, or even in communism itself, depending on the context, everybody is guaranteed a job or an income or something like that. So this switching over into positive rights and saying this is what people deserve. And of course, one of the core differences as well is liberalism is about individual rights, and then the capitalist economic model is about the production of profits and infinite growth. The orienting philosophy of a socialist society is something like, in a communist society to be sure, something like, how can we use the collective resources at our disposal to create the highest quality of life for individuals in this society? That right there totally shifts your entire approach to these problems. It's not a matter of getting these tyrants off our back, the free market, the free exchange of ideas. It's like, no, what kind of society do we actually want? And that's where positive rights come in. And certainly it would look something like that. Go to any liberal city in the United States, any huge liberal city, and you're going to see blocks and blocks and blocks of homeless people without access to mental health care, people with addiction issues that society has tossed to the curb. And that's all perfectly in line with liberalism, right? And their belief about agency of the individual and of individual rights. So shifting individual rights toward collective rights while still respecting individuals, right? Because healthy collectives are made of healthy individuals and vice versa. And advancing positive rights instead of merely negative ones, I think is definitely a step in the right direction. But I'm also not knowledgeable about law and jurisprudence and all of that. So I'm very limited in what I can say here.
Yeah, building on that a little bit too, I think is like, if we want to ask the question of like, what would rights look like in a socialist context, the Constitution of the USSR can give us a little bit of a clue to that, right? Because it also outlined rights. And I think interestingly, if we look at the Constitution of the USSR, we can see that there were the negative rights that you would expect included in it. Those are still there. Freedom of worship, freedom of speech, etc., are still codified there, and we can have conversations about whether or not those rights functionally were enforced in the Soviet Union. But there were a list of positive rights as well. There was the right to education, the right to work, the right to healthcare in certain contexts. There was a whole set of positive rights that were put forward as well. So I think you're spot on, Brett, with that. And the other thing that I would say is, aside from the question of rights, if we want to talk about like what is a theory of law that is not a liberal theory of law, but that could be a Marxist one, part of that I think is a matter of, thinking about law through a lens very similar to how Lenin thinks about the state. One of the difficulties about how liberalism conceptualizes the law is that the law is supposed to be an essentially apolitical entity that exists on a level above politics to regulate and intervene into it for the public good in some sense. And again, this is very similar to how the state can be conceptualized within liberalism as well. And one thing that we can do, taking Lenin's criticism of the state, is also recognize that the law is a tool of class struggle. The law is a tool of class domination. In the United States, any critical assessment of the legal system here shows that what your class is affects how you get treated. It affects if you get convicted in the first place in many instances, and what your sentencing is on top of that. So stepping outside this idea of the law as this kind of like mystified thing that stands above politics and class and governs it can be important. And that also means recognizing that in a socialist context, the law itself can be a tool for proletarian dictatorship, right? It is a way through which the proletariat can wield power. You have to be careful with that, but it is a tool of class struggle, is a tool of class domination. So stepping outside of a liberal view of the law, I think, requires understanding it in relation to class and kind of demystifying its function there.
Yeah, I thought this was a very interesting question, and my response, actually, I think Allison has essentially anticipated it. My sense is that maybe there wouldn't be a theory or a philosophy of law and rights under communism. Maybe under socialism as a transition, when you still are going to have a state, the things that Brett mentioned would be fundamental to it, and essentially as many realms of social existence that can be decommodified, that would be the goal, it seems to me, under a kind of rights regime. So all of those rights that make it not a market function to provide, the essentials of a quality, life. And that would have to be part of it. But I think more broadly and fundamentally, the fact is that law is an instrument, as Allison was saying, of class struggle. I had a professor who once put it quite nicely. He said that law and jurisprudence was a science of property. I mean, it is a form of knowledge that is generated to ensure, property rights fundamentally. It's a science and a form of knowledge that develops from not just capitalism, because of course there are conditions and traditions of law in pre-liberal bourgeois states, but fundamentally, I think under communism we would have these principles, but we wouldn't necessarily have them in a legal sort of framework. I think it's hard for us to imagine it, I think. So I would like to think more about what that would look like. But I think the whole regime of law is tied to a form of state that I don't think would exist under communism.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Adnan, and I'm glad you pointed that out for sure. All right, let's go ahead and move on. We got a little bit longer here. I think we maybe have room for a couple more questions, possibly. Again, thank you so much to everybody that's engaged with the Patreon and asked these questions or in the chat right now. All of us are more or less reading this, and we really appreciate you being here. So one of the last questions here is, what threats do increased automation pose in a capitalist organization of the economy, and how does socialism address these problems? I'll go ahead and start while other people sort of digest that question with just the one obvious point, which I always make in the automation discussion, which is that under capitalist mode of production and social relations, when automative technologies come onto the scene, they're inherently non-liberatory, and what they actually do is make human labor compete against technology for jobs. And there's certain ways that capitalists might try to, grease that groove and iron out those wrinkles. A UBI is one of the ways they might do that. But fundamentally, the private ownership over the means of production in the age of automation is going to mean more and more inequality, more and more value being produced, but the products of that value, the profit of that value going to fewer and fewer people, while an underclass of people grows and grows and grows. We're already started seeing that sort of outside the context of automation, just as the natural machinations of capital. But I think in the age of automation, that's going to be increasingly the case. And so how a socialist society would differ is that we would fundamentally see automative technologies as something to invest in so we can liberate people from the worst forms and the most degrading forms of labor. And the value and the resources and the wealth produced by those automated technologies would not go into the pockets of one person with some government handouts to soothe the rabble, but would instead be reinvested into society as a whole to make sure we have things like housing for everybody, healthcare for everybody, etc. And so just the very nature of the form automation takes under capitalism is fundamentally different, and it must be fundamentally different than a socialist approach to that same exact technology. You will never have liberatory automation in a capitalist mode of production and social relations. But the introduction of automation will also increase the contradictions between the private ownership of capital and private property and all these things as well. And that's going to lead to interesting developments on that front as well. So those are some opening thoughts, but does anybody else have anything deeper to say?
Yeah, just briefly, because I know that Allison and Adnan will probably have much better things to say than I do. But, sometimes we see, again, this is something that we see online, but I have heard it in person as well. Something along the lines of, oh, well, Karl Marx was writing about capitalism, 150 years ago. He didn't foresee computers that could do the jobs of 200 people. Like, tell me you haven't read Karl Marx without telling me you haven't read Karl Marx, because this is something that he directly addresses. Automation and mechanization is something that he directly addresses. So by saying that he didn't foresee this is exactly what he foresaw. But the key point is what Brett already raised for me. And that's that you have to look at the social relations of the society that the automation is taking place in. Automation, there is always a tendency to drive for automation because there are jobs, there is work that needs to be done that is not particularly pleasant work. And so there is always going to be the tendency to drive for automation in these forms of work. The social relations of the society is really the key component here, because if you're in a capitalist mode, capitalist relations within society and a capitalist mode of production, as Brett said, the value that is being extracted is going into the hands of the few. You're creating a larger labor aristocracy. All of these things that Brett was touching on. These people are competing against each other. It allows the capitalists to drive the wages down. It allows them to pay less for labor. It allows them to extract more value from the material inputs as well as the labor that they are utilizing, just as a sheer factor of they're utilizing less labor and they have more competition for those places. Like this is inevitable under a capitalist mode of production and capitalist relations. Under socialist or communist relations, this is no longer an issue. The entire point is that we must go beyond the capitalist mode of production. We must go beyond capitalist relations in a way that when there is value that is being generated, that value is being shared in an equitable fashion, that value is being shared societally rather than going into the hands of the few. I mean, this is just and the decisions that are being made should be made for the betterment of society. We also have to think about not only where is the money going, but who is making the decisions. If we have, big fat cat sitting at the top of a corporation saying, well, I'm going to automate this because it's good for the bottom line. There are other externalities to keep in mind. How are the other people in that community going to get by if we're not equitably distributing things? What are the environmental externalities at play with the automation and mechanization of various processes? These are not necessarily insignificant, but they're things that are not thought about under a capitalist mode of production. These are things that under a socialist mode of production, with socialized decision-making and socialized distribution of value, these are things that can be considered. And this is just fundamentally different. Right? It's fundamentally different. There's just one other thing that I'll say very briefly, which is that we also have to consider the imperialist side of things. Automation just deepens the contradictions between the imperialist core and the periphery. Under a socialist or communist, state, or communist state, kind of a what's the word I'm looking for? Somebody help me. It's still early here.
Oxymoron.
Thank you, Brett. That was exactly what I was looking for. Oxymoron. It's an oxymoron. In any case, under those mode of production and those relations, you can begin to think about justice and equity for people in the periphery, in the global south. But under a capitalist mode of production, this is not going to be the case. Automation is always going to push, these contradictions between, quote, workers in the core and workers in the periphery to even greater heights. Okay, go ahead, Adnan.
Well, there's not really much to add other than just to re-emphasize the point that it isn't automation itself. If we socialize the gains in productivity and the possibilities of production in automation, democratically, then that's great. I mean, less work for us to have to do. We can turn our, talents and energies to other aspects of, fulfillment in life, and what could be better. But the problem, of course, is that all the gains are being, monopolized. So I would say that, a lot of things would be automated, if these were organized around, human needs, right? Like very poorly paid labor. If you actually had to, do this democratically, we would find all kinds of ways to, develop technologies to do all of the kind of terrible and horrible work that people don't want to do if they actually had to, pay for this. But because all the gains can be monopolized and exploited, automation is being used as part of class warfare, essentially. But in that process, it will develop forms of technology that actually could be used to liberate us from work, and that is a great thing. I mean, no one should fetishize working. I mean, Marx did not believe that the goal was for everybody to have a job. Right? That wasn't his goal, full employment. His goal was to liberate us from work. And, that's the difference, I think. It's fundamental. It's not the process itself. In fact, capitalism, in his view, was a progressive force, horribly exploitative, but also creating conditions that could liberate us in a new way.
Yeah, one thing that I would want to add to, I think, is that one thing I think to consider as automation occurs is also what that opens up in terms of organizing and labor. I think that's an important consideration. So just one thing I'll add, because it's been on my mind a ton recently and in the news a ton, is obviously like one of the big breakthroughs in automation that's occurring right now is with AI, which is now able to produce art at very high fidelity in interesting ways, also write copy, which will affect a lot of jobs, and also write code, which will probably affect a lot of jobs. And one thing I think is interesting there is, as scary as that is, and as much as that is going to have a detrimental effect, I think it also has the ability to kind of push proletarianization of some jobs that kind of have escaped certain levels of proletarianization, right? One thing that Henry mentioned is that automation allows bosses to drive down wages, drive down a whole bunch of other things. And if we think about things like the tech sector, which I actually think is going to be hit pretty hard by automation with what we're seeing from like the GPT model's ability to write code, we might think about how this is a sector that has been hard to organize in because tech workers have been kind of given a petty bourgeois position within the economy in terms of how they're treated. And this could further push proletarianization in some of these fields that have kind of escaped it to a certain extent in a way that might open possibilities for organization as well. So, obviously, like when we're thinking about AI, automation on the whole, how that functions in capitalism and socialism is totally different. But we should say we are here under capitalism now. As automation transforms industries, how do we respond to it and interact with it? And I think that there will be openings into industries that have been harder to get into because of its ability to potentially drive proletarianization. So I think that needs to be followed closely and, considered tactically as well.
All great points. Both Malcolm and Daewoo in the chat have been asking for this question, so I'm going to make sure we touch it before we kind of go into the last question or so. And this one, I think, is related to what I said on the recent Red Menace at the very end of our recent Red Menace episode on Desert by the anonymous anarchist writer, about my views on climate change having shifted a little bit. So the question is, Brett and others, can you elaborate on your shifted perspective regarding the climate change outlook, and what information made you change your mind on the matter? I just want to kind of be clear here. I'm just saying that, like, relative to my position a year or two ago, where I was much more, I would say, hyper alarmist and sort of like inevitable with the collapse that's coming because of climate change. And I went through some, even rough mental periods of time where I really was like on the dark end of doomerism when it came to climate change. Is just that I think it's not going to be as catastrophic maybe as we might have previously thought. And it's really relative to my own belief, not relative to any huge shifts in the environment. For example, the last IPCC report that came out had the optimistic note of clipping off the most extreme version of warming that was hitherto a real possibility. And I also am seeing these developments, prices of renewables going down, people across the world taking the issue more seriously, being impacted by it, and thus responding to it. And my point is that as as the climate destabilizes and the impacts are more and more apparent, there's going to be continued investment and continued work and continued agitation around this issue, meaning that it's not going to be the best case scenario, nor is it going to be the worst case scenario. And in the context of that Red Menace episode, I was arguing that some people on the revolutionary side of things can sometimes view the inevitable collapse brought on by climate change as their only hope for revolution. And I kind of wanted to push back against that. Like, okay, what if this collapse doesn't come? What if, these states are able to adapt, or there is, we talked about climate Leviathan and all the different trajectories that it could take. But my point there was not that it's not going to be terrible, not going to be apocalyptic for some people in some places. Absolutely true. But just that relative to my earlier deep existential crisis in the face of climate change, I kind of have moderated a tad and have seen some developments which I view as somewhat optimistic. And it was kind of my point there. But again, I'm not trying to downplay the seriousness of it. It's going to create a lot of tragedy. It already is. It's going to create a lot of opportunity. And it already is in some sense. And people that are the least, responsible for it are going to suffer the most, and that's unacceptable. And, I'm not trying to downplay the issue as a whole, but especially in reaction to some things I see online and stuff where people say things like, I'm not going to have kids because why would I, have kids when civilization is going to be done in 30 years? My kids won't even grow to be able to see adulthood. And the anti-natalism that can sometimes come out of the most extreme versions of apocalyptic climate change ideas. And I kind of wanted to hedge a little bit against that, fight against anti-natalism and those things. So it was really relative to those issues and not me saying like, oh, a new thing has happened that I totally didn't see coming, and now we don't have to worry about climate change. So I just wanted to make that clear. But I would be very interested to hear all of your thoughts on climate change, where you think it's going. Are people adapting to it? Is it going to continue to adapt? Is it going to get very, very ugly for everybody? Is it more catastrophic than I'm letting on, et cetera? So kind of how, in this time and place, because all these things develop, right? 2 years ago, I felt different about it than last year, and I feel different about it this year, and next year it could be more dire, and I could retract this statement, right? It's an ongoing process. So where are all of you at with regards to the climate issue?
I'll be really brief. So again, going back to one of the first things that I said, I try not to think of it in terms of wins and losses. I think of it as trends. I think that some of the trends that we've seen in the last year have been slightly less bad than they were, looking a year or two previously, but I still think that they're looking quite bad. We also have politicians, including the president of the country that I am currently in, saying things like, global warming is going to open economic passages, shipping routes through the Arctic, which is going to be very good for Russia. They're going to be able to ship over the top of the globe instead of having to go, through the Atlantic or the Pacific. Like, this is a very worrying statement from a leader of a very big country. And I know that it's not only Vladimir Putin that is saying this. I've also heard some US politicians say similar things like, the thawing of the polar ice caps is going to open new shipping routes, and it's going to make inter-country commerce much easier, much more efficient. This is a very worrying tendency to look at, what are the silver linings that we could find from absolute catastrophic environmental degradation and climate change. This is not very encouraging for me to try to find a silver lining, because it assumes that you're going to have very negative consequences. And the thing that we have to keep in mind is that these negative consequences are not going to be equitably felt. They're going to be disproportionately felt by people in the global south, particularly places like Mozambique, who have severe flooding and increased typhoons that hit them as a direct result of global warming. And study after study have shown that the severe weather-related disasters that Mozambique has been facing in recent years are directly attributable to global warming, climate change, whatever you want to call it. We also have things like the thawing of the permafrost, which is releasing massive amounts of methane here, a little bit to the east of me in Siberia. But, the permafrost there is thawing at record rates. There are very, very worrying signs still. So while we have had some trends that have started to look not quite as bad in the last year, for me, things are still looking quite negative, and we need to have major societal shifts in order to go past this. And this needs to be led by the countries that are already developed. We can't just say, hey, I'm Duke University. Let's look at how much we can reduce emissions if we switch all of the wood stoves in the Democratic Republic of the Congo to gas stoves, which is literally a study that Duke University put out. And I mentioned in the upcoming episode with Jason Moore, or maybe it was one. We have an upcoming episode with Max Isle on guerrilla history as well. It was in one of those two episodes I mentioned that Duke had the study come out where they were like, how much emission can we reduce if we switched all of the wood fire cooking methods in the Democratic Republic of Congo to gas or natural gas cooking? It's an absolutely moronic suggestion that this is going to be something that is going to in any way impact the climate for good. Change needs to be made in places like the United States. Continued advances need to be made in China, which has made some advances recently, but needs to do far more. All of Europe, particularly Western Europe, needs to make major advances. So we need to keep that in mind, that while things may not look quite as bad today as they did 1 or 2 years ago, things are still looking pretty bad.
Yeah, and having been on that episode where that discussion came up, I will just briefly say, from my perspective, I don't think it's so much that I don't think climate change is as bad, and more that I'm just more pessimistic about the idea that the capitalist state is going to find a way to hold on, right? I think that for me is more what the shift is. Reading Climate Leviathan, I think, had a lot to do with that, of just pushing back against the idea that even catastrophic climate change means something like a singular collapse scenario, which you often hear talked about on the left. That's more kind of where I'm coming from. And as Brett talked about on our episode on Desert, like that can be a kind of defeatist utopianism in itself, right? It's kind of a way of saying like, we don't have to do politics because this collapse is coming. So I think it's also worth pushing back against that as well in a really important way. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. It's not that I think climate change is less bad. It's that I think that this, capitalism and capitalist states might be more adaptable than I was previously assuming.
Yeah, all really great, important points. And I see the many great points in the chat as well. Love that we have such intelligent listeners and audience members for sure. But we've been going for 130 minutes, over 2 hours, approaching 2.5. We're all getting a little bit tired. Henry, it's in the morning for you, but I'm sure it's still tiring because you had to wake up so damn early. But I thought we had one final question. It might be kind of a fun way to end a rather serious discussion, which is, do you believe in New Year's resolutions? Like, do you put any stock in that idea at all? And if you do, what are your New Year's resolutions for 2023? And I guess I'll answer first just to give everybody else time to digest that question and come up with their answer. But I actually, with my family and my kids and stuff, we did it this year. It's like, just something to work on. It doesn't have to be a very specific goal, but just something you're going to work on. My 13-year-old daughter really impressed me by saying that her self-generated goal is to read 6 books for fun this year. And, I really got a little moment of pride that that's what my daughter wants to do. So I'm very happy with her. My wife's New Year's resolution is to develop yoga, get better at that. I like that goal as well. And mine, I've gotten recently into weightlifting myself. And so my big resolution for 2023, my personal resolution, is to advance my strength and cardio, my conditioning, get better at lifting weights, get good at the techniques and the forms involved, and just try to be a fitter person all around and to set a good example for my children in that respect as well. So my personal New Year's resolution is really centered around that development for me this year. So yeah, what are all of your resolutions?
Well, it might be a bit of a cop-out, but I'm a bit older than the rest of you, so I've had more years of failing to live up to my resolutions, and so now I no longer believe in resolutions, at least for myself. And I like to kind of rationalize that by thinking that it really isn't about this sort of individual kind of personal goal. I need the social conditions to transform in order for myself to make the kind of progress in life. But of course, I would like to read more and exercise more. And I feel after the health discussion earlier that there is really a politics around sort of health and fitness that is quite interesting. And we should take care of ourselves. So if I were to have resolutions that I thought I could keep, it would probably be to exercise, and so on. So yeah, but my cop out is that I don't believe in resolutions anymore, from personal experience of my own weakness and inability to keep to them.
Adnan Hussein, no improvement needed.
True. I agree with that
He's perfect as
message.
he is.
I guess I'll go. So I also never really make New Year's resolutions. I never did, but I do have things that, I guess some people could consider them like resolutions, but for me, they're like eminently achievable and planned things that I'm planning on having come out in the near future. So like I mentioned, I have the book, the new translation from the original Italian with a new foreword of Domenico Lasordo's Stalin, History and Critique of a Black Legend. I already know that that's going to happen. Like this is a resolution that we're already well along the way of. The foreword is already written. Several chapters have already been completely edited. Translations have been finalized. The rest have been roughly translated and are just going through editing right now. So this is something that'll be out in like a month. I don't have to worry about not achieving this goal. Keep your eyes peeled for that, by the way. It's an excellent book and one that we'll definitely have to talk about when it comes out. Otherwise, like my wife and I were planning on not eating any processed foods in the month of January. We cook dinner for ourselves every day anyway. We never eat out or anything like that. Like it's always home cooked food, but we tend to snack a lot outside of meal times. So this was something that we were planning on doing anyway. But since it's starting in January, I guess you could consider it a New Year's resolution. But other than that, it's just like, read more, engage more, get out more, engage in my community more. These sorts of things that I've already been doing, just try to do more of them. So that's my resolution.
Awesome. Yeah. So I do believe in New Year's resolutions. I feel like they're good to kind of like give some focus. And I usually don't hit them, but every once in a while I do. So I usually try to think of them. My big one for next year is this year I got super into rock climbing. For me, it's really important to have a physical activity, that especially one that is like very mental, helps keep me grounded, helps give me a break from reading and thinking about things, and just kind of like physically connect with existence. And that's been super important for me. So my big resolution is just to keep, moving forward with that, learn to lead climb, get outside more, spend more time in nature climbing it. That's kind of the big one. I feel like, just really emphasizing exercise, physical activity, super important for me. Been one of the biggest things for helping me both mentally and physically. So just kind of leaning into that more in 2023 is definitely the goal.
I absolutely love that. That's great. All right. Well, I think we're going to end it there. Again, thank you so much to everybody in the chat, everybody that showed up to this. Thank you so much to anybody who submitted questions to be discussed here. I hope we didn't let you down. From the bottom of my heart, I'm deeply appreciative of Henry, Adnan, Allison. You're all friends of mine. I love you all dearly. I hope you have an absolutely wonderful 2023. And huge love and solidarity to everybody who listens to any of these shows and gets anything useful out of them. We are here just to hopefully create content that people find useful, informative, and maybe even inspiring. And we're going to continue to work on that as hard as we can in 2023. So love, solidarity, stay safe out there, and we'll talk to you on the other side of this calendar year.
And I would like to just take the opportunity also to express my appreciation for Brett, because I know that he's thanking us for doing all of this, but I think that most of the people that are watching this are also realizing that you're kind of the nexus of this entire thing. Like Rev Left, Red Menace, Guerrilla History, you are the common denominator between these. You are the foundational block of all three of these shows. And without it, none of us would be able to do these shows. And I know that the listeners, and I was a listener from very early on, we've learned a lot from you. So I want to express my appreciation for you as well, Brett. But why don't we, as we close out, tell the listeners how they can find us on social media. Brett, you can go first.
Okay, yeah, you can find everything I do at revolutionaryleftradio.com. You can find all the socials as well as all three shows at that website.
Awesome. Yeah, you can find Red Menace at red_menace_pod on Twitter, and you can check that out.
Yeah, you can find me at Adnan A. Hussein, Husain on Twitter, and check out the Crusading Society course. I mentioned it on the stream, and it seemed like in the chat some people are interested. You can find a link to join the Google Meet and past episodes or past sessions are recorded and available. You can find out about all of that at www.adnanhussein.org/courses. Hope to see you in a future week.
Yeah. As for me, as we get ready to go to work now, you can find me on Twitter at Huck1995, HUCK1995. You can follow Guerrilla History on Twitter, which is collectively run by me, Brett, and Adnan, at Guerrilla_pod, GUERRILLA_pod. I will just remind everybody that we have a Guerrilla History spinoff show that'll be starting within the next couple of weeks called Guerrilla Radio. We'll be advertising that via the Guerrilla History Twitter feed. So if you want to know how to subscribe to that and where to listen to it, be sure to just follow Guerrilla History, again, Guerrilla_pod on Twitter, and you'll get all of those updates. And you can support Guerrilla History on Patreon at patreon.com/Guerrilla History, GUERRILLA history. I know that times are tough. Inflation is hitting everybody hard, but if you appreciate the work that Brett does at Rev Left, or Brett Nelson at Red Menace, or myself, Adnan, and Brett at Guerrilla History, consider dropping a couple dollars in on any of those three. A little bit goes a long way for us, and it does make it possible for us to do the show. So thank you very much for everybody that turned out, and thank you for supporting the show. So on that note, Brett, why don't you close us out?
There you go, Henry. Thank you for keeping me grounded. All right. Red salute to everybody. See you in 2023. Be safe out there.